Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Monday, the 6th of January, where we are continuing along with our textbook. And I hope you had a good weekend, and I hope you were able to use the weekend to get access to the textbook. There is a hard copy on reserve in the GCC library. You're not allowed to take that book out of the library, but you can scan the pages or photocopy the pages or even photograph the pages. And I'm covering the major points of what the textbook is discussing. And the textbook is basically reviewing good principles to put into place for speech delivery. And because we are such a highly condensed class, your first speech is coming up soon. This is going to be the autobiographical speech, the 5-minute speech in which you get to tell your audience, your classmates, and also to tell me a little bit about yourself. And I've suggested that there are lots of different ways that you could go about putting together such a speech. You could do a life overview, and that means that you would obviously condense and put together some highlights. Or perhaps you want to focus on a particular time period or a particular element of your life. That's something else that you could do. A third option I suggest for people who may not necessarily feel that comfortable with self disclosure is talking about education, since that's something that we all share, whether you wanted to review your educational past or whether or not you wanted to talk about your goals for your educational future, or perhaps you just want to talk about why you're enrolled in an intercession class at GCC. So we began by talking about the first 3 chapters in the textbook to help prepare us. We also talked a little bit about Toastmasters, that international organization that is devoted to helping individuals develop their public speaking skills. And Toastmasters came out with a great video reviewing the process of speaking. So even though it's a little bit dated, the concepts are the same. And I'm hopeful that you had a chance to watch that video. And in terms of the attendance questions, which you have at the ending of every class, today's attendance question is going to be related to speech number 1, because I'm hopeful that you had a chance to really consider how you might proceed with the first speech. And what should help you are the 3 chapters that are assigned for today. The first being organizing and outlining, which is perhaps one of the major elements of, perhaps the major element of putting together a speech. Beginning and ending speeches, because starting and ending can be particularly challenging. And lastly, wording your speech. So, in terms of organizing and outlining, and you can see that I've got my notes below all of our videos, and what you are looking at is literally my outline. So, I like to use basically an outline that divides up main points and then subpoints by using letters and numbers. So, you can see that our first element, organizing and outlining, is divided up into several categories. And I've labeled those categories A through F. And you can see that underneath each of those subcategories, what I've got are points. And I just use dashes to illustrate the points that are related to that category. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. It doesn't necessarily have to be done this way. This is just my preference in terms of organizing and outlining. Um, One thing I can say, if you've spent the time organizing and outlining, it'll be easier to remember the points of your speech. It'll be easier to present your speech, and that makes you more credible as a speaker. We talked a little bit about ethos and being ethical, and it also makes you more persuasive as a speaker. Now, your first speech is on content that you already know and that you already have some built-in ethos about. After all, it's your life, it's your experiences. But as we proceed over the course of the semester with the informative speech and the persuasive speech, the content is going to become probably more difficult because this isn't necessarily a review of your life history. And also, you might need to establish more ethos or credibility. So, there's a reason why I started with the autobiographical speech so that you could focus purely on just the major elements that we've been discussing thus far. So, you don't need to use outside resources for this speech. You will for your third speech, the persuasive speech, because that lends to your credibility and it also increases your persuasiveness. That said, the second speech, the informative speech, you are going to be required to use some audio or visual because you're teaching the audience. And you might have heard about different learning styles that people learn differently. So if you can use visual and audio in addition to your own presentation, that just helps your audience remember and understand the information that you're presenting. And you don't have to use an audio visual for your first speech either. Certainly, there's nothing stopping you from using an audio visual in your first speech or even using outside resources in your first speech. As I had indicated, if you wanted to interview family members for your autobiographical speech or to look up some of your historical records from family lineages, you can. But the focus of the first speech is that you've already got all the information that you need. It's just a question of organizing it. And what you need to have is a thesis, is a central idea. I've given you a topic, a general um, um, idea of what it is you're going to talk about, but of course you need to refine and develop that to something more specific. The good news is that you've probably done this in other classes, certainly in English classes. One of the reasons why English 101 is a prerequisite for this course. And what you've done when you've put together a paper is you've had probably some sort of an organizational plan. And the Toastmasters video talked about this as well, that you could divide it up into an introduction, a body, or a conclusion. And we also talk about the body as the discussion section. So you can use either either piece of terminology that you'd like. But the introduction is where you greet your audience, and this is going to be important because you want your audience to know when your speech is starting. It could be just as simple as saying hello or thank you for having me here today. This is our cue to pay attention. And oftentimes the speaker will skip that piece because they're anxious. Or when we get to the body, what ends up happening is that sometimes people rush through that body because they're trying to finish their speech as quickly as possible, taking time. And again, you've got only 5 minutes. So part of learning how to deliver a speech is learning how to manipulate time so that you're within the borders of the boundaries of what you've got with your time. You don't want to be too much under, you don't want to be too much over. Of course, you don't have to be right down to 5 minutes exactly. No one's going to be there with a stopwatch. But again, think about balance. So figure something like about, you could be 30 seconds to, I don't know, 50 seconds over and under, and that would be fine. Now, you don't want to be 5 minutes over in a 5 minute speech because obviously that's double. If you were giving an hour speech, then perhaps being 5 minutes over would be fine. But again, it's about balance. And as I had indicated, this is not a class in editing. So what you want to do is to have one take. You don't necessarily want to splice together different takes. So that means it's not going to be perfect, but no speech is perfect. And in terms of the conclusion, making sure that you say goodbye to your audience. Again, that's oftentimes something that speakers will forget to do because they're so anxious and they're so relieved that they don't cue us. And it could be a cue as simple as saying thank you. Or do you have any questions? Please let me know. And of course, this is going to be a little bit more challenging because we're working through recorded speeches, but you can always invite people to send you questions to electronically if you so wanted to do such a thing. Not that you have to. So, some of the organizational patterns that you might have used in the past when you've put together a paper: chronological time order. First this, then that, then that. Makes a lot of sense when you're trying to teach somebody a process of how to do something in steps. Or perhaps you can organize things topically by categories, which is how I've organized things in our notes below. I've divided things up from A to F with different categories. Or perhaps order of importance. Maybe you can put the most important thing first. That will help to capture your audience's attention, but the negative is, will you be able to maintain your audience's attention? Or the exact opposite. You could put the least important first and the most important last so that you leave with a lasting impression. But the negative of that is, are you going to be able to maintain your audience's attention until you get to the most important? Spatial, when you're describing a location. This works very well for, let's say, something like a real estate agent who's trying to discuss a piece of property. And they might tell you that when you walk into the home, immediately to the left is the living room, and to the right is a garage. And then there's a small staircase in front of you that leads to the kitchen. Off to the right is a small bedroom. Off to the left is a dining room. You've never been in this property, but I'm trying to describe to you what it looks like. Though I could have tried to sell you this property through order of importance. And of course, sometimes that's subjective. Perhaps the most important thing is that it's in a good neighborhood. But again, it'll depend on the buyers or your audience, if you will. Because while one set of buyers might be most concerned with neighborhood, another set of buyers might be more concerned about price. So you could perhaps talk about it topically, and you could talk about neighborhood and price and updates that have been done to the house, not necessarily ranking them in any order of importance. Or perhaps you could talk about that piece of property in terms of time, which would work very well if it's an older property, a historical property, so you could go through the property's history. Or perhaps new construction, that would also work very well. I don't know if it would work very well for a piece of property that's 30 or 40 years old. It's neither old nor new. Yeah, so regardless of what organizational plan you use, and you can mix and match pieces of these as well. You know, you could do causally, as showing relationships between things. You want to have your speech make a certain level of sense to the audience. So it's always a good idea to test out your writing or your speech with someone else. And that means that you want to make sure that you're using transitions and connections from one idea to the next. So, some suggestions: that audiences tend to respond really well to that which is familiar because they can connect with that. Audiences also tend to respond really well to questions. You want to make sure, though, that you're answering that question within the context of your speech, unless it's a rhetorical question where the assumption is that the answer is obvious. You never know, however, what might happen in a live situation. I remember asking my Shakespeare class a rhetorical question once, and this actually happened to be about a play that you might be familiar with, Midsummer Night's Dream, where through magic spells, a beautiful fairy falls in love with a laborer, a human laborer, who's basically an ass. His name is Bottom, but he's also transformed through magic into a literal ass, a donkey. And the rhetorical question, is that how could this beautiful fairy fall in love with an ass? Leads to the question of, well, how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? I had expected some chuckles. Instead, I got some hands in the air with some anecdotes. Just goes to show how timeless and universal Shakespeare is. So, one of the things that I think is very human is that if a question is asked, you tend to try to answer it in your mind. Um, Problem and solution. This works very nicely for a persuasive speech where you have to show that there's some sort of difficulty and then you're offering some sort of a solution, or at least partial solution. Or process of elimination is another suggestion where you give all the options and then you just keep eliminating. So you want to have a speaking outline, which I differentiate from a written outline, that the written outline that you use for a paper is better if it's more detailed. The more detailed your outline is for your paper, the less work you have to do as a writer. It's the exact opposite as a speaker. You want less. Less is more. in your speaking outline. You want just keywords and phrases so that if you do have to refer to your outline, you can very easily see where it is that you are. You don't want to read your outline. You want to make sure that you are maintaining eye contact and body language and all of the other elements that we will be discussing in terms of performance. And you can even list things like stage directions in your outline. I've had students list things like breathe in their outline just to remind themselves to take nice deep breaths, which is basically actually when I had asked you the question of what are some ways to reduce anxiety. And I can tell you that breathing is one of the primary ways to reduce anxiety. When we tend to be anxious, we hold our breath. And this is the time when actually we need oxygen the most because we have to fight or flight. I remember being in a women's self defense class once, and we were told if we were ever attacked, we should yell out the word no. And I and my classmates had assumed that was to draw attention to ourselves. That was secondary. Primary was that by yelling out no, we were forcing oxygen into our lungs when we would need to either fight or flee. So taking a nice deep breath. But of course, things like meditating, being well prepared, um, being in, it sounds strange, but an outfit that feels comfortable, that you're not self conscious about, all of those things can help with reducing anxiety. And some anxiety is a good thing because it shows that you've got some element of concern about the activity. You just don't want anxiety to stand in your way, so to speak, and prevent you from being able to perform in this particular instance. So, as you know, with the attendance questions, you don't have to interact with your peers, but I encourage you to do so. But you do need to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So, you'll get lots of suggestions from your peers about anxiety and ways to reduce anxiety from the last attendance question and my responses as well. So, some people, like myself, prefer old school paper, and I encourage you to have a paper copy in front of you and not to rely on an electronic copy. Because if there's any kind of mechanical failure, then ultimately you don't have access to your outline. And also, oftentimes, if you've got multiple screens going at the same time, you can see the glare of the screen. So it makes it even more obvious that you've got a screen that you are accessing for your outline. Note cards, old school again, but can work very nicely where each card has a separate idea on it. And I'm going to be asking you to submit your speaking outline to me on the day in which you upload your speech. I'm going to be adding a section onto our Moodle site for you to upload speech number one. And I wanted to take a quick look at your outline and be able to give you some suggestions. And I want to see the outline that you're actually using when you're delivering your speech, not the outline that you are creating. So you should never deliver a speech without an outline, just like as I had indicated earlier, a trapeze artist should never really perform without a net, though a good trapeze artist probably doesn't fall into the net. And you, as a good speaker, may not even necessarily need to refer to your outline, but it's there just in case. And you can deviate from your outline. That's okay. In the real world, no one would see your outline but you. But again, I kind of liken it to following a map. If you deviate, well, then you run the risk of getting lost, so to speak. Now, the textbook gives you a lot of examples of outlines. I think they're much too detailed. That those outlines are great if you're reading a book, because if you were to read the outline, you basically have the speech itself. But there isn't any way that you're going to be able to maintain eye contact with your audience or with the screen if you've got an outline that is that detailed. So, really, what you want to do is to condense. And one suggestion is to basically write out your speech much like a paper and then reduce it to keywords and phrases. And basically, what you're doing is you're just summarizing to the audience what your paper was. And this can work in the reverse direction, where if you need to write a paper and you're not quite sure how to proceed, you can talk out your paper and transcribe what you've said, and that can be the outline. So our memories tend to be notoriously poor. It's one of the reasons why it's very helpful to have a speaking outline. Studies have suggested that we can remember plus to minus 7 items to plus to minus 3 items, which is nothing. Particularly if we're doing -3, that's 2 or 1. Now, obviously, we remember a lot more than that. We do things, and you might have used some of these techniques, chunking, where you're grouping like items together. We oftentimes do this with telephone numbers, for instance, where we divide the first 3 digits, and then we've got the 4 following digits. Or mnemonic devices, memory techniques, whether we're using an acronym, or you're using the first letter of each word of something that you wanted to remember. Oftentimes this is used in math classes or in science classes, but even composition classes. One acronym for writing is KISS, keep it simple, silly, or keep it simple, stupid, which seems a bit harsh. And of course, repetition. So each time you repeat something, you're more likely to remember. It's why advertising works so well. So, beginning and ending the speech. And while you will spend probably less time on the beginning and ending, there is a memory element called the primary recency effect, that people remember best what they hear or read first and what they hear or read last, which means that introductions and conclusions are particularly important because that's what your audience is going to be remembering. So, in terms of thinking about techniques, and I suspect that you've utilized some of these techniques in writing your own introduction or writing your own conclusion. Some techniques that tend to work well, and again, you can mix and match. Reality, talking about something that is applicable to real life, it will oftentimes get an audience's attention, and that's something you can use in an introduction or conclusion. Proximity, something that's nearby geographically, will get your audience's attention. Familiarity, and I think about how I read news, and I do read news, by the way, and I recommend the Associated Press. I teach media classes, and that's one of the things that we talk about, the difficulty of being able to find news sources that are valid and trustworthy. And while you need to be on alert with all news sources, the Associated Press is a pretty good news source. And I'll skim through the headlines, but if it's something about education, I'll read the headline in its entirety. If it's something about higher education, I'll probably skim the article. And if it's something about GCC, I will read it in its entirety. And I think this is very much an indicator of things that are real, things that are nearby, and things that are familiar being of particular interest to an audience member. Suspense. So we like suspense, and sadly, we also like conflict. News organizations will use the idea of conflict to get clicks, so to speak. Humor is another wonderful way to either begin or end a speech. Humor can be tricky because humor can sometimes be offensive, so you need to think about that. Just stating that something is important in either your introduction or your conclusion, or both, can give it a sense of importance. Question answer, as I suggested, that if you ask a question, you need to supply an answer, that it's very human if you ask a question for individuals to begin thinking about possible answers. Quotation. So you want to make sure that the quote is relevant. You want to make sure about balance. The quote isn't too long for the length of the speech itself. I remember listening to a speech where the speech began with a quote. It was somewhat of a lengthy quote, but that wasn't the problem with it. It's that they began with a quote and didn't tell us they were going to begin with the quote. So they were reading the quote so that they could be accurate. And the thing is that we had assumed that the entire speech would be read. Luckily, that wasn't the case. But one of the suggestions I had for that particular speech is to begin the speech by saying, let me begin with a quote, so all of us would know and wouldn't fear that the entire speech would be read, in effect. Storytelling. People love stories. Again, you've got to think about, is it relevant? And again, you've got to think about balance and personal references for introductions and conclusions work wonderfully. Startling statements can work wonderfully as well, but again, you need to be careful. You don't want to offend the audience. I think I was talking last class about a speech where at another institution where the person wasn't necessarily considering the occasion or their audience, which was their classmates and their teacher, when they literally began to disrobe so they could show their true selves. I do think about another speech that I myself heard that was startling, but it was very effective. And it was during a face to face class, and we were on break, so nobody was really paying a whole lot of attention to what was going on. And we were delivering speeches that day. And I know I was just rifling through my notes and papers and so forth. And all of a sudden, a student at the back of the room began choking. And I remember it seemed as if time slowed down as I was getting up and thinking about, can I reach the student? Do I remember the Heimlich? I need to call security. I didn't never had a chance to even make it to the student because the another student who was standing next to the choking victim performed the Heimlich, and out popped a rolled ball of paper. Quite surreal. We were all looking at this rolled ball of paper, and the person that performed the Heimlich calmly walked to the front of the room and declared what we had just witnessed was a simulation, and asked us if it hadn't been a simulation, would we have known how to perform the Heimlich maneuver. And this was the student's informative speech about how to perform the Heimlich maneuver, a topic that could be considered a little bit dry, but now all of us had instant instant what's the word that I'm searching for? Um, if nothing else, we were fascinated by the idea of how the speech was put together, and we had instant buy-in in the idea that we needed to learn the Heimlich because just a few minutes previous, we were in a situation where we thought that we would need to perform the Heimlich maneuver. So we had instant interest. That was the word I was searching for, interest in the topic. So it had all been planned. The person who was choking was a friend. They weren't choking. They were pretending to choke. They had a rolled ball of paper in their mouth. They pretended to perform the Heimlich on their friend, which can be a very serious sort of thing, actually. If things had gone wrong, if the person actually swallowed the paper, I don't know what would have happened, and began choking. But luckily, it had all been planned very carefully. I mean, you can damage, ribs, things of that nature if you're performing the Heimlich. So I'll never forget that speech. It made such an impression. So yes, you can do something that's startling, but you again need to have a lot of planning in there. Or forecasting and summarizing. In your introduction, telling the audience what you're going to talk about, then talking about it, and then in your conclusion, reminding us what you talked about. And then the section about wording your speech. And the Toastmasters video talked about this as well, is that you want to have a conversational style. You don't want it to be as stiff or as formal as if you were writing an academic paper. But again, you're not just speaking with a friend, so you want to kind of have a sort of heightened conversation. And in the oral style of delivery, which is different from the written style when you're actually writing out a paper, you use simpler vocabulary, shorter sentences, and it's much less formal. And some of the things you can do in terms of wording your speech is utilize definitions. And we usually think about the dictionary definition. That actually is called the denotation of a word. And I have a memory technique for remembering this, is that they both start with D. Denotation, dictionary. And the word definition also starts with D. So there's 3 Ds there. But you can also have the connotation of a word, which are the associations of a word. So for instance, take 2 words like cheap and frugal. They both have the same denotation. You don't spend a lot of money. The connotations, very different. Cheap is seen as something that's more negative, being stingy, as opposed to frugal, which is seen as something that's more positive, about being smart with one's money. advertisers, again, put a lot of thought into not only the denotation of the language they're using, but also the connotations, the associations of words. Or a negative definition, defining what something is not. We usually define what something is. But you could define, for instance, wealth as not having financial success, but having health and happiness. So this is a whole different way of thinking about wealth. Or a contextual definition, that the definition is determined by situation. I think about a word like brief. Then in a composition of a class, that would mean concise. In a fashion class, that would be an article of clothing. In a law class, that would be a legal report. So again, depending on the situation. So even definitions can be manipulated and used in terms of how you word your speech. And then there are advanced techniques. And remember, we're at the beginning of our journey here where we're thinking about breathing, greeting your audience, making sure that you are clear. The advanced techniques, oftentimes you see elements of this in literary works, whether they be poems or short stories, where you're using imagery, which can assist visualization, and you're appealing to the senses, sight or touch, or any of the other senses. Or a metaphor where you are comparing two dissimilar things, and you are not using the word like or as. If you are using the word like or as, that's called a simile. A metaphor is comparing two dissimilar things without like or as. I remember hearing a speech about a student who was comparing herself to the color red, and she didn't say she was like the color red. She said she was the color red. It's a very, really interesting speech, an autobiographical speech. And she talked about all of the symbols associated with the color red and all of the associations that could be applicable to her. So at first, it was quite clever, when she's talking about being passionate and that she can have a temper, but as the speech went on, it became a little bit less obvious, which can happen when you're using these more advanced techniques. She started talking about the colors of the inputs in a battery, and it became a little bit hard to follow. So you need to be careful with that. Or alliteration, words that have the similar sound at the beginning rather than rhyme, which is words that have a similar sound at the end. And if we think about some of the great speeches of our time, in fact, many of the evaluators of the great speeches have ranked Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the very top. You'll see this on rhetoric websites and things of that nature. You utilize many of these techniques, but you don't have to hold yourself to that particular standard. Think about the idea that your language needs to be audience-centered. It needs to be appropriate for your audience. You can assume that you're speaking to an audience of adults that are educated, but they've got general knowledge. They don't have specialized knowledge. Obviously, if you're speaking to a group of children, you probably proceed differently. And you want to try to be as culturally sensitive as you can. You want to be as inclusive as you can in your language. That said, the whole point of language is to communicate. If you get to the point where you're afraid to say anything because you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing or offend somebody, well, then that negates the whole point of public speaking. But certainly try to be cautious with your words. And, I can tell you that as much as I try to be cautious, I still wonder if the mailman is coming every day when I know I should be saying postal carrier, and I would write that out. And, pronouns also have become challenging, as well as thinking about terms that are as inclusive and neutral as possible. But don't let that stand in the way of your being able to communicate to your audience. So, in terms of today's attendance question, as I had indicated, I wanted you to be able to think a little bit more about upcoming speech number 1. And this attendance question will be due 24 hours from now. So if you're watching this video on Monday, even though I'm going to try to post the videos the night beforehand, you have 24 hours from the Monday, so on Tuesday the 7th. And of course, if you need an extension, please ask and I'll be happy to grant it to you. What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1, and why? What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1, and why? Again, you're not required to interact with your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So hopefully by reading all of your peers' responses and my responses in turn, this will give you a good idea of the class discussion that we would have had in a face-to-face class now that I've presented this material as we prepare for speech number 1. So I hope you are doing well, and I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about important elements in terms of delivering speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.